This video takes what we have learned in the last two videos regarding the DOM and how HTML is interpreted by the browser and how JavaScript is pulled in and has access to the document object model. We're going to take all of that, and now we are going to use those references to elements that we get through the query selector function on the DOM or document. And we are going to learn how to modify elements now using a couple of functions, a couple of basic functions that we get from JavaScript and is provided on those DOM elements. So we're going to use the same project we've been using for the last two. It's the DOM example zip archive you can download with the videos. So make sure you download that if you don't have it. Unzip it and then open up that project folder in Visual Studio Code like we've done in the last couple of videos. We're not going to do that again for the video. Go to those other videos if you need to figure out how to do that. So using that same project, we're going to go ahead and open up or launch our index.html in a browser. We're going to use Chrome, of course. We've got our simple document here. We're going to go ahead and open up our Chrome developer tools. And we are going to play around with this in the browser right now instead of worrying about JavaScript files. And we're going to manipulate the document that we have here on the left, and we're going to do that live right here. And we're going to use the same functions that we've used in the past. So let's pick an element that we want to modify. So again, let's do intro, and then let's go ahead and hit our DOM element again, our H1 DOM example element. And we know that it is in a section, and it is a section with the ID intro, and we are looking for the first child element that is an H1 tag. So if we remember how to do that, we want to get a reference to it, so we're going to need a variable to keep a hold of it. It's the way we grab right on and get a reference to a particular object in JavaScript. So let main H1 is what we're going to call it. And we're going to do our document.querySelector. And then we know that it is an ID of intro, and we want the first descendant or child of that section. And we know that it is an H1 tag. And so that's going to be our query string that we submit to the query selector. Now let's verify that we've got the right element by just outputting H1 in the console. And we see we've got the right element and that we have a live connection to that element. We can tell by hovering over it, and it lights up in the browser itself. So we've got a live connection to it. So the first function that we're going to learn that lives on a DOM element that we get from JavaScript that allows us to modify it is inner HTML. Oh, actually, let's do inner text. We're going to do inner text. So inner text is actually this part of our element. So it is the text that lives between the two tags. So we want to modify the text in there. And right now it says DOM example. So we're going to use the inner text function or method on the element. So main H1 is our reference to our element. And on that we should have a method available called inner text. And you'll see these two right here. We've got inner text and inner HTML. So we're going to go through both of them, but let's start with inner text. And it's actually not a method or a function. It is actually a property of the element. And so we're going to go ahead and use the equal sign because we are going to assign whatever is on the right-hand side of the equal sign to that variable or property of that element called inner text. So right here, let's just go ahead and change it to something else like I have been changed. And once we hit enter, because this is a live connection to that DOM element, we should see it change, and we did see it change right there. I have been changed. So with this, once we have a reference to a DOM element, we can do all kinds of things to that DOM element. So right here, we went ahead and we changed the inner text of this main H1. The other cool function, or the other cool property that we have that we can play with on this element is the inner HTML. Now, inner HTML does similar things to what the inner text does, but instead of adding text or a text block inside of the two tags, what it allows us to do is it actually allows us to add additional HTML inside and replace the HTML that lives inside of a tag. Now, in an H1, you normally don't have a bunch of additional HTML inside of that. Usually it's just text. So let's play around with a different tag. Let's find a different one we want to play with that usually supports additional HTML inside of it. And so let's go with, how about just this section? If we do this section, we could change the HTML that lives inside of this section, and I'd probably see a dramatic change to what's in our browser. So let's do that. So let's say let main section, and of course these variable names I'm just making up so that I know what they are. Document.query selector, and then we are going to pull just the intro. So at intro, or pound intro, because we're looking for the ID, the element with the ID intro. And now let's make sure we got it. And we do. We have a reference to that intro. And here's the interior HTML, or the inner HTML of that element. We have an H1, and then we have our paragraph tag. Well, with our connection, our live connection to that main section, we can actually change our inner HTML and actually pass it a string of HTML that has different content in it. And what it'll do is it'll replace the current HTML with whatever HTML we create in the string. So let's go ahead and let's add, let's change it to an H3 instead of an H1. And let's say I have changed again dramatically. All right. Let's see if I spelled that dramatically. All right, and then we got to close that tag. So here's our H3 closed. And then instead of a P tag, why don't we use a div? And inside of that div, let's go ahead and use a span and give it some text. This base content has changed. We got to close our span, and then let's close our div. And that gives us all of our tags properly opened and closed with new content. We hit enter, and we see the content has changed for that section. And because we didn't use a paragraph tag, we have no padding after that, so it almost makes it look like it's part of the table now. And if we explore our HTML or the live DOM in that section, we'll see that we now have an H3 instead of an H1. We've got a div that holds inside of it a span with that new content. So you can see inner HTML doesn't actually add new HTML to this element. What it does is it completely replaces the HTML inside of that element with the new HTML that you created in this string. Now sometimes that's useful if you have an entire section of a web page that you need to replace with HTML that has been dynamically created in your JavaScript, or you've received from a web server or from an API. Inner HTML can be useful. There are some other methods that are usually more useful when you're getting into complex scenarios where you're manipulating the DOM and you need to add and remove elements, but you don't want to remove everything or all child elements within a parent element. You just want to add new elements. And we'll get to that in the next video.